Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Israel's economy has surprisingly withstood the blows striking global commerce and finance in recent years, including COVID-19, uncertainty in the oil market, and disruptions in supply chains. But can the Israeli economy thrive when the domestic political scene is perennially unstable and when individual households complain that they do not reap the fruits of macroeconomic success? Joining us from Central Israel to discuss this matter is Professor Eytan Sheshinski, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Governance and Economy. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Also joining us from elsewhere here in Jerusalem is Professor Nellie Munin, who is an advocate whose expertise lay in international trade law, who formerly also served as Minister of Economic Affairs in the Israeli mission to the European Union. Thank you for joining us as well, ma'am.
Hello.
And also joining us here in the studio, as usual, is our TV7 editor-at-large and host of TV7 Watchmen Talk, Powers in Play, and so much more, Mr. Amir. Oren, Amir, give us a broader understanding of Israel's current state of play within the context of its economy.
So the men and women in the street, which is not Wall Street, but rather Main Street, or in Israeli terms, Dizengoff Street, they are not interested in what the economic experts are saying. They worry about the pocketbook. They worry about the purchasing power. And you can see the various politicians now vying for power in the elections. Some of them are saying that the economic indicators are excellent and that the Israeli economy has withstood so much turbulence over the several recent years, while others, including the leaders of the opposition, are saying, yes, this was true until a year ago, but right now the Israeli economy is receding and it needs someone more experienced at the helm to put it back in shape. And you see that one of the major topics in the election campaign is cost of living. So let's leave it to the expert to tell us whether what we feel individually is correct and whether we should be happy because the country's economy is probably on the up and up, even though several million Israelis feel a bit otherwise.
Indeed, within the global feeling of uncertainty and instability, of course, to what degree, Professor Sheshinski, would you regard Israel as a safe haven for economic stability if it is indeed this case?
Well, I think the data shows that Israel is indeed fairly stable relative to the rest of the world. The rest of the world has undergone. Israel was also stable, relatively stable, even during the COVID recession and backdrop. And since then, we have been in pretty good shape, all in all. Now, there are a number of structural problems which are besetting the world economies, and including Israel, but to a lesser extent. So I'm referring, of course, to the inflationary pressure. Governments have tried to have poured money and easing monetary policy, both in the U.S. and Europe, particularly in the U.S., also in Europe, and to some extent also in Israel. And eventually, what some economists have predicted has happened. Inflation has started to rise. In the U.S., it's pretty high. It was 8%. There is a debate how long this will last and what are the causes for this inflation in Israel. But again, to complete the comparison, in Israel, inflation is around the 4%, 4.5%, and so relative to the U.S., for example, and to most European countries, we are in reasonable shape, even on the inflationary front. The cost of living, which you have mentioned, is an issue in Israel, and that is besetting Israel for quite a while, particularly the last 2 years on the housing front. Housing has risen by 18% in central Israel, on average. It has risen elsewhere in the world as well, but in Israel more so. We have to remember that demographics in Israel are somewhat different than the other countries. We have a high birth rate, and it's still a relatively young country. And so the need for new apartments, around the 70,000 a year at the beginnings, housing beginnings, a year, to keep prices stable, has not been met in previous years. Last year, we are back to the level of about 70,000 dwelling beginning of housing starts. So we are on track. The Israel Land Authority, REMI in Hebrew, Reshut Mekakei Israel, has offered more supply side. So the supply side has been taken care of to a large extent. Interestingly, the housing completion is lagging behind, and there's still a puzzle. Many are wondering why is that? The regulatory constraints, bureaucracy, and so forth. But on the whole, supply side has been taken care of in the last year. It has to be sustained, and so hopefully this will happen. Now, on the other prices, there's talk, of course, in Israel, as you all know, about reform on opening up for imports, particularly the agricultural sector, and this has not happened. The agricultural sector is quite powerful.
And we'll touch base on that momentarily, as we would like to focus on this more specifically. I'd like also to hear, Professor Munin, your assessment on Israel's economic state of play currently, please.
I agree with Professor Sheshinski that if we look at the macroeconomic terms, we can see that the picture is quite stable or quite positive, because inflation, although it has risen, is low compared to other countries, and seems to be under control. And also unemployment rates have decreased considerably after the COVID shock. Also, as we look at the ratio between Israel's debt and GDP, it's encouraging, and it seems to be under control, and the deficit is almost non-existent, because in recent months Israel succeeded to collect more taxes than it expected, partly due to the high prices of housing that Professor Sheshinski mentioned, and partly due to some very successful high-tech ventures. So if we look at the macroeconomic picture, it really looks encouraging, specifically compared to other countries. But if we go into more details into the microeconomic picture, there we can see some systemic issues which should be taken care of. One of them is the growing inequality between the rich and the poor, which we can see, which also depends to a certain extent on the high-tech sector, which is very, very profitable compared to other sectors which cannot compete with it. And the prices of housing, which are rising, not only because there is a growing demand of those who want to have an apartment to live in, but also because it is considered a way of investment for many people who do not know what to do with their savings in a world where there is no very good alternatives. Either if we look at at the financial markets, which are not very stable, or the banks, which do not offer any good terms to savers. So in Israel, housing is also considered a certain kind of investment that yields some fruit. And this is another problem which is even growing due to the demand of those who also want to live in an apartment. And it is mainly, but not only, in the center of Israel.
Nevertheless, of course, Professor Sheshinski did mention that supply is increasing with roughly 70,000 for the upcoming fiscal year. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Oren, when we're talking, however, within the international context, winter is coming. Winter is coming. We hear in Europe, of course, due to the heavy reliance for years on Russian gas and the attempt to divest from Russian gas and to try and seek alternative means, including from Israel, with a trilateral MOU that was signed. And just earlier this month, there was a trilateral discussion between Israel, Egypt, and the European Union on moving forward with pumping gas from the offshore reservoirs in Israel to Egypt, and from Egypt, of course, transforming it to LNG, and then through Egyptian infrastructure to ferry it into Europe. Do you see Israel sustaining itself within the context of all the lack of energy supplies and other angles within the upcoming period in time?
So happily enough, I can evade this question because Professor Sheshinski is one of the foremost experts in Israel, having led a seminal study of this very issue several years ago. And he can better answer it than I could ever expect to. And also, I would add to that that another growth engine is the high-tech startup sector. And right now, there are clouds over it. Is it a bubble about to burst?
With diminishing foreign investments, of
Not
course?
only that, but again, let's hear Professor Sheshinski and Professor Munin about it.
Please, Professor Sheshinski.
Yes, thank you. Of course, the energy, let's see the picture. The energy is a problem particularly for Europe, but all over. The Russian-Ukrainian war has, and Russia using its natural resources, mainly gas and oil, to achieve certain goals in this war. Europe is very worried. Germany, for example, depends 40 to 50% on Russian gas from Gazprom and the pipeline, and they have just stopped Nord Stream 2. It's a squeeze on the gas. You look at the prices of gas, which have gone down in recent years until the last year, but now are skyrocketing all over. We haven't seen gas prices at the range of $8 or $9 per heat unit. LNG is even higher, and clearly Israel's resources, the offshore gas deposits, are an asset in this respect. But I should mention, by the way, Israeli consumers are not suffering from these high prices because there are long-term contracts between the electricity company, which is sort of the anchor client of gas, and these long-term contracts are keeping the prices at $4.50 per and so forth, rather low compared to what other countries are paying for the gas at this point. You're right. Israel has about perhaps close to 1 trillion cubic meters of proven gas reserves, using about 20 billion a year for consumption. This allows Israel to export gas, and I don't think that this should be, the government should prevent them from increasing the gas supplies. You're right. You have mentioned that there is no direct pipeline between Israel and Europe. It's unfortunate because the economical line would have been from Israel to Turkey and from Turkey to Europe. But given the politics in the past, this is non-existent at this point. but the shipping gas to Egypt, to the liquefaction plants, the two liquefaction plants which are working at subcapacity, and they can increase their absorption of Israeli gas and then ship liquefied gas to Europe and to the Far East as well. That's certainly something which is on mind in Israel, and Israel can use it. And the franchisees who is now Chevron is a major franchisee, buying off Noble Energy and Delek, and now another deposit, Karish, will start operating soon, assuming the debates with the conflict with Lebanon will be settled. It seems that way, at least. Both sides think that we are close to an agreement on that, as well as some deposits which are close to Cyprus, and Israel will expand and perhaps buy off some of the Aphrodite deposit there. So yes, energy. Israel is of course is no replacement for Russian gas. Russian gas is a huge source of supply to Europe, and Israel will be a minor one, but still a welcome one by Europe, which is welcoming diversification of its resources, wishing to be less dependent on Russian gas, and particularly these days when Russia is using the gas as one of its instruments in this unfortunate war with Ukraine. So gas is indeed the energy is indeed a source for Israel, and it was mentioned already that this year Israel has a surplus in its budget in the collection of tax revenue has exceeded forecasts. Mainly also the high tech. The high tech had an exceptional, unprecedented boom this year, and as it was mentioned by Professor Munin, this has also contributed, of course, to the pressure on housing, particularly in the central areas in Israel, Tel Aviv and vicinity. But the question is, for how long? What is the length of this kind of pressure?
Indeed.
Given that the high-tech sector is entering into not a recession, but I would say a slowdown, some slowdown in investments too, and even letting workers off, firing workers, not only in Israel, by the way, in the US as well. Some of the large technological firms have let off some of the workers, so there's some shrinking.
Of course, within this context, many of those companies have offices abroad in multiple locations, the larger ones, of course. But I'd like to ask on this particularly, and also Mr. Owen mentioned the cloud hanging over the high-tech sector, considering that it is one of the strongest sectors in Israel. And Professor Munin, maybe you could elaborate on this. To what degree does the international instability currently, or the impact of international uncertainty, impact foreign investment into high-tech companies here in Israel? And does this drive a certain trend, if you may, in the context of the capacity of those companies to draw in more investment?
Well, certainly we see some slowdown, which is connected to what happens globally right now, to the global financial instability, to the inflation, etc. But it's not assessed by the high-tech sector in general that this is a major problem. Some of the high-tech ventures are still succeeding to recruit investments, and it depends. It might depend on many other things. The relevance, the attractivity of those specific ventures, their importance or contribution or potential contribution to the needs of the current global economy, etc. And I want to say that this is, luckily, it is not the only engine of Israeli growth. It is a main one, and it is affected not only by, or the entire Israeli economy might be affected not only by the global instability, but unfortunately also by the local political instability, which you mentioned, Jonathan, in the beginning. But luckily, as I said, it's not the only engine. We also have the security industries, which are thriving right now because of the global instability, political instability. And we also have the renewable energies, not only gas, which is actually considered an older source of energy, but also all kinds of developments which are more concentrated on solar energy, on wind energy, etc., in which Israel has some very interesting developments, which are very attractive to local and foreign investors. And also another anchor, which is very important to refer to, is the fact that in recent years, Israel invested in diversifying its trade partners. And the latest example is the Abraham Accords, which also allow new developments in terms of regional ventures, regional cooperation, which were not possible in the past. And this is something else which brings new players to the Israeli arena, like the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and recently Bahrain, which Israel starts negotiations on a trade agreement. And those countries can be clients and investors for all the industries, the Israeli industries and services which Israel can offer, and the Israeli know-how.
Indeed, even though much of those Gulf Arab states are much more inclined on acquisitions rather than foreign investments in many of the endeavors within the context of this region, from what I've been reading as of late. But if I may, Mr. Oren, I'd like to ask Professor Sheshinski, as we don't have very much time left for today's program, to please elaborate, of course, on the matter that you spoke of earlier with regard to particularly the matter of exports and imports. There was an attempted reform. This reform failed. Could you provide us a little bit of insight into this? And if you could do so relatively briefly, as we have roughly 3 minutes for this.
Allow me just to go back to the previous issue which was mentioned, namely the gas. It was also a crop year, a wonderful year, an exceptional year for other natural resources which Israel has. The major one, of course, is the potash from the Dead Sea. The prices of potash around the world is all natural materials. All the chain of supply, as it is said, have risen in prices, and potash is now rocket sky high. It was already 800 or so per ton. When my committee looked at it years ago, it was around the 300, 250 or so. It's amazingly high, and huge profits for the franchisee, which is the ICL, the Israeli chemical plant, the Dead Sea plants, and and indeed this will also increase their contribution to the wealth fund, to the sovereign fund, to the wealth fund that was established at the time. Indeed. Now, you asked me about you want to ask about other issues. Professor Munin rightly was pointing out about inequality. Of course, the high-tech boom is creating some kind an inequality, although The figures about inequality in Israel have not risen in recent years. In fact, they went down slightly. But this year, the boom year in high tech created a very high divergence between the young entrepreneurs who are in the high tech sector and the rest of the economy, and this will have to be addressed. And if I mentioned in closing here only one more issue which we cannot leave aside, which is the educational system. The educational system. We had a strike, not which was settled now, but the Israeli educational system is in trouble. There's no question about it. We have a significant fraction of the population which is not the curriculum does not include what is considered basic studies of mathematics, English, and so forth, and chemistry and so forth, physics, and this will continue for a while. These are long-term processes, and so I view the demographics of those who are not attending schools which offer those subjects which are necessary for a modern economy, which Israel strives to be, would like to be. That's our ideal. This is going to be with us for quite a while and perhaps even exacerbate the gap.
Indeed. Of course, the matters of education are crucial, especially in small countries where a pragmatic government needs to be able to understand what direction to push the children in being able to accumulate knowledge in a certain or accommodate necessities. But unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Professor Sheshinski, Professor Munin, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's program. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.